Thank you. And I debated whether or not I wanted to sit down and actually do a PowerPoint for our presentation, given the lateness in the afternoon, the period after lunch. And so my thought process was, back in school, I had a professor that used to say, you turn off the lights, you lose half your audience. My thought process is, well, maybe I can try to keep it moving here. So no PowerPoint presentation. Appreciate the opportunity to come talk to you from a Western air regulator's perspective. I know we've heard a number of different things here today, and I really just want to really applaud the conversations that we've had around this. And as I sat down and started thinking about the questions that I was asked to bring forward as a panelist, I wanted to kind of take a little bit of a run at the situation. And so my first thought was, let's answer the question about what states need in order to actually implement 111D. And then, as we think about it, the demand side reduction. So how I kind of started running into this was the first piece of perspective. One of the things I think that is most important as we look at this particular plan is to really consider, how did we get here? How did we find out all of this was important? We spent an enormous amount of time and energy this morning talking about the health impacts. We've talked about the regulatory impacts. We've talked about how it could be achieved, what sorts of behaviors might be there. But why is it that we're talking about it? And the answer really comes down to the fact that air pollution had a real significant impact on public health, especially as we saw pictures from like London in the 1950s where we're having smog in. Well, what caused that? There's meteorological conditions that largely sat in on top of London and forced all of that air pollution to just stick there. And we had acute health problems, people passing away from high exposure to different kinds of air pollution control. And so we started to ask ourselves, well, wow, what did we do in response to that? And at least in the West, where we started learning from the experiences of others, we started taking all of our really large sources of air pollution, sticking them in rural parts of our state, saying, well, at least we're not exposing the public in those particular instances. And so one of the reasons why you see some of the disparity in the maps, even as you look at Arizona and the West, is that we've largely put some of these very major sources out in places where they're not going to have quite the severity of impact on public health. Okay, so well, why is that all important? I always think it's important to bring a perspective, because there always tends to be a little bit of guilt around, gosh, how did we ever let this happen? And the answer is that this is really the next in a long list of unintended consequences that have come with making decisions and learning from past practices about air pollution control. Because as we get better at controlling those criteria air pollutants from our regulated utilities, it starts to look like something you could start to put back down with your population base, or in some cases say, couldn't we do this better? Couldn't we do this faster? Couldn't we do this cheaper? And so one of the things I think that's always most important is we're looking at a 111D plan, and one of the things that I think is going to be very helpful in a state like Arizona, where very much we have a Republican slant on things, and we're one of the very few Republican states that's not out there fighting with EPA right away. Why is that? Well, because our utilities have said it's important. Our people have said it's important. It's something that we need to look at. We need to do it rationally. We need to think about it in a reasonable way, but how do we get back? How do we get there? How do we make it happen? And so instead of having a lot of guilt around this issue and dragging people through the muck of, hey, we should be all feeling guilty for these giant power plants that sit in the middle of nowhere, we should think about the reasons why they're there, the economic impacts that they had on rural communities. And I know there was a question earlier about the Kentucky issues, where there's violence in some of the meetings that goes along with, hey, you're changing the coal. Why is that important? Well, because we're taking jobs from rural areas, right? That's how people see it. What am I going to do? Where am I going to send my children to work? The whole plan in life has been that they'll grow up here, they'll stay here, they will work in that coal mine, their kids will work in that coal mine, their kids will work in that coal mine. So we've taken a way of life away from people. It's no different in rural Arizona, where we're talking about shutting down coal-fired power plants. People there have a real serious way of life that needs to be addressed here, and some thoughts about, well, how are we going to economically subsist? And so I want to take some of the guilt out of that particular issue and talk about this more as a to-do list, right? These are the things that we need to be thinking of in these particular cases. So I really appreciated Dr. Arnold's statement earlier, and this is why I kind of came up with this point of perspective, and lots of perspective is really necessary. It's that we need to be also able to reasonably compromise, recognizing that a lot of what we asked for is a lot better than none of what we asked for. And I think that's really the approach that we're trying to take in our cases. If we listen to a lot of different perspectives, I really think that there's going to be an opportunity for us to balance a lot of the needs and concerns in a way that everybody can walk away with something and make significant progress on a very important issue. So my second point really is that, gosh, there's been some great panels today, and a lot of the thoughts I've had to redo my notes like 3 or 4 times. Oh, they already covered that. Oh, they covered that. Great, they covered this point. So if I could really come down to it, Ken Colburn, Commissioner Martineau, and a lot of our previous panels and panelists have set the stage for my conversation. The biggest thing that we need now as we start to look towards demand side and what we would need to do for a 111D plan is creativity and innovation. I think Ken hit that really out of the park. And it's really, if I can coin a phrase for you, willingness to think outside the blocks. You know, got to combine box and blocks, right? But honestly, that's a really big barrier for states to overcome. We're very used to looking at it and going, hey, EPA used this set of tools to come up with a goal. That's the only way we can comply with it. And that's not at all what EPA is saying. EPA has said in a lot of different ways, hey, you've got a lot of flexibility. This is just how we set your goal. This is your target number. You don't have to do exactly that. And so we really do need to be creative. We need to be innovative in thinking outside of just those four particular blocks, or look for other ways that we might be able to take credit for issues. We need to be able to work across functions and have a leveraging of expertise, right? So forums like today are really important. We've heard from a number of different people who normally don't get into a room and talk to each other, right? We usually go into our own, I'm an air regulator, I sit in this room, this is my air plan. You know, I'm not going to talk to anybody about how I could make this more socially acceptable. I'm not going to talk about the public health impacts. That's where we're going to go. And it really actually means a lot, too, as you look across government. So Tennessee has an interesting perspective where the Tennessee Valley Authority is 99.7% of the sales there. Well, in Arizona, we have kind of the best of both worlds. We have a Public Utility Commission and the Arizona Corporation Commission, and we have a quasi-governmental utility in the Salt River Project, which was largely built to bring water into the valley. And so when we start talking about all those pieces, and you start thinking about the traditional state implementation plan aspects, you're thinking there's just no way to make all of this enforceable without really stepping into somebody else's lane, right? And our energy regulators are really good at what they've done. Arizona has a very balanced portfolio. Sounds like Tennessee has one as well. We're about a third coal, about a third natural gas, and about a third nuclear as a state. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens through careful and prudent planning by these individuals. So we need to leverage that kind of expertise as we're going through. We also need to be willing to make it work. And so one of the things we talked about is how underutilized 111D itself is. We all tend to forget that 111D was used in the mid-2000s for a failed program in the Clean Air Mercury Rule. But one of the things that Arizona learned through that experience is that if you're willing to try, you can still make good out of it. So when the Clean Air Mercury Rule came back through, not to belabor the entire point, but it was this trading program for trading a neurotoxins. It just didn't sound like a really great idea to us. Plus, the issue was that there was no guarantee that we'd get emissions reductions in the state, and to us that was unacceptable. And so we sat down, we talked to our utilities, we talked to a number of different people, and we came up with an idea that not only will we play in this trading scheme, but we're also going to have an additional statewide requirement of a 90% emissions reduction. Well, CAMR got tossed out in the mid-2000s through the whole federal court process, lots of different reasons. But one of the things that stuck by through all of this time was the emission standard that Arizona set for its utilities. And lo and behold, as the new Mercury rule has come out, the mercury toxic standard, looks a lot like our final rule. It's about a 90% reduction over what our existing utilities would have done. And so there's opportunities for states to exercise some leadership here. And even if this program doesn't necessarily survive legal challenge, you can still benefit the environment, you can still benefit public health, and you can still do it in a way that's meaningful, that people can get behind, because we actually achieved early emissions reductions through that particular program. You're going to have some guts to make some long-term decisions without focusing on just the short-term benefit. And so what do I mean by that? Well, the first thing to look at a 111D type program is to say, well, we're air emissions regulators. We know what it takes to actually measure those emissions. We know how to reduce those emissions. Let's just stick to a mass-based program. Let's get it done. Well, if you stick to a mass-based program under 111D, what you're doing is you're shifting all of the emissions from your existing sources to new sources that will fit under a 111B program, which do not fit under 111D and are not subject to the same requirements. And new natural gas largely can comply with 111B without doing any additional control. So while you'll have the immediate short-term benefit of cutting out a lot of coal, we're going to be back here in 10 years when EPA starts revising new source performance standards, saying, what are we going to do with all these old stranded assets of natural gas facilities to get our next step of emissions reductions? And so we really need to be thinking about long-term impacts and strategies, which is where demand-side reduction actually comes into play. How do we utilize the existing infrastructure and make it better today and naturally transition to low or no types of carbon emissions? And I guess the last point that I'd like to make under this one is that there's always a reminder that no matter how smart we feel like we are today, there's always that unexpected consequence that we'll regret tomorrow. I have a favorite band. I love one of their songs. It starts off with last year's wishes or this year's apologies, right? We just didn't realize, and I'm now apologizing for all the things I thought I was doing really well. So what does that mean? Well, as we took a look at this example in Arizona where we'd be forcing those kinds of emissions back into our population centers, we have an unexpected consequence of utilizing more natural gas, creating more ozone in areas where we already have ozone problems, and exacerbating that problem by making it more difficult for those areas now to come back into compliance. And so we just need to be able to balance all of those particular health effects as we think about it. So I'm going to try to speed up a little bit here. Cooperation is key. We've talked about it. It can't only be just at the governmental level. It needs to be at regional levels. The grid is regional. The solution needs to be as well. This crossover of environmental law and energy regulation is exceptionally important. We're not the only state where we're having those kinds of arguments between a corporation commission and our state regulators and trying to make sure that we stay out of each other's lanes. And that can actually be a really big barrier to getting anything done if we're not working cooperatively and in conjunction with the folks that do this as well. And so it can be done. We just need to leverage those kinds of experts' abilities. And I'll talk to you a little bit about something we're looking at right now. The last piece that you really need kind of as the big picture perspective is a lot of ideas. And so Arizona's engaged in a number of stakeholder meetings. I think we've held 7 large stakeholder meetings with our public at this point, just looking for ideas. And you can imagine the list is long, but it's not so long as to think that they aren't things we couldn't have thought about. It's just a matter of how do we get credit for some of those things? How do we make sure that we're getting credit for people that install solar water heaters? What about the demand side or distributed generation, those kinds of pieces? But one of the things I think that's missing, and one of the things that could be really helpful here, is that library of lessons learned. No one state has all the solutions, and we can learn a lot from each other. And so if there's one thing that we're looking at that the universities can help with, the NGOs can help with, states can help with, is coming up with some sort of a library of best practices, ideas, areas where we could be learning from each other on what energy efficiency might look like or what renewables work well. So in terms of specifics for areas to focus on, the first thing I'll talk about is good regulatory middleware. I'm not an IT guy. I play one on TV from time to time. But the idea here is to get something that allows us to interact between this idea of federal enforceability and state law. Right? We need something that sits over the top of regulatory commission laws. We need something that sits on top of environmental laws and can be that functional equivalent of the enforceable program. And so how do we work on those particular pieces? Well, states are obviously best suited to achieve the goals that are there. We have the best abilities to balance the affordable and reliable energy needs in our state. We need to make those meaningful reductions. We're in the best place to do that. EPA, largely through its building blocks, just set goals for states and said, we think you can do this. Go see what you can get done. And so how do we get credit for the existing programs? How do we remain respectful of those existing laws and regulations? And so the potential solution that Arizona is looking at is, and we're not fully sold on this yet, we're still thinking about the different pieces though, is an allowance-based credit system, something like what the Western Resource Advocates have put out. And so if you haven't had a chance to see their paper, it's worth Googling. It's a fantastic read. Essentially what it would do is require emitters of carbon that have carbon emissions above the goal for the state to carry a negative credit for every carbon emission above the goal which they emitted. And for anybody who's underneath that goal, they get a positive credit. And as long as your negatives and positives equal 0 or a positive number, you as a state are actually complying. What we like about that is that looks like that effective middleware. It allows the regulatory commissions to still regulate, to set targets, set goals that don't have to be enforceable commitments, and allows people to figure out, hey, I either can sell my demand side reduction efficiencies that I've done, or I can sell my distributed generation versus forcing somebody to do X, Y, and Z, unless the market really dictate where those ideas are coming from. And so it's a system that we find very interesting, as several of our utilities have quietly said they find interesting, and we're trying to see if we can actually make work as a state. So if that ends up working, the last ask is, and you've heard this a couple of times, I'm going to bang that same drum, is the evaluation, monitoring, and verification standardization. I think Diane hit it out of the park on this particular issue, but the more commonly we can say a credit is a credit from state to state, the better off we all are. Because essentially, if you take a Western Resource Advocate-like approach, you're essentially creating a new currency. And it's going to need to have the same kinds of protections that currency will. You're going to need to be thinking about how the credit is done. Can it exchange between states? Can a conversion be applied to it? What happens with banking? Does it inflate? Does it deflate? What happens over years? Does the value of it disappear? And so the more we can get around a monitoring and verification standardization, I think the better off we all are. And that actually looks like a really good area for state, well, we'll call it a state implementation plan, so not the most articulate term for it, but the SIP for it to be looking at. That's an area where we can find common agreement, where we can just say this is the way we're going to credit the system, and this is what we expect to see out of the system, and we think we can make these pieces work. So yeah, the long and short of it, it comes down to if we can find those particular areas, if we can get some help in places we don't have a lot of experience, like behavioral science and how we best modify behavior, I think we're going to be in a better spot for demand side reduction. But really the best thing is how do we create a system to take credit for it and then allow the market to actually dictate those emissions reductions. So with that, thank you.